Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am here to introduce your part two of my surprises for you because I'm the best. So, welcome back to Lady of the Lore. I'm your host, Kelly Ornelas. I'm happy you're here, and I hope you are too, because today I have another special guest star. I had, again, the privilege and such a fun conversation with Dr. Dotson of University of Texas at Tyler, a new professor of mine, at least. I've never taken a class with him before, but I'm looking forward to what this upcoming semester will hold for us. So I hope you're excited for this discussion. I hope you enjoyed last week's. If you do, share with your friends. I want to do like the whole like, share, and subscribe, but that's up to you. I'm going to leave that with you. So let's get on with it.
So, if you will please state your name for the record.
I am Dr. Emery Dotson. I'm an assistant professor of instruction at the University of Texas at Tyler. I received my PhD from Texas A&M in 2022.
Gagum.
Giggle, always. And before that, I received my bachelor's degree from UT Tyler in 2006, my master's degree in history from UT Tyler in 2009, my master's degree in political science in UT Tyler in 2014. So I collect a lot of degrees. Like that's what I do.
I'm trying to be like you, I think.
Yeah, just keep getting them, right?
And so, your research experience, your research interests, where do those lie for the audience?
Okay, so I am a modern Americanist, and a lot of folks ask, what does that mean? So technically, it's 1877 to the present,
Okay.
which a lot of folks don't consider 1877 to be modern America, but that's where it starts. My research interests specifically are in civil rights movements. And mid 20th century is kind of like the sweet spot of my favorite time period, and just kind of understanding the different movements of the civil rights movement. So often when we talk about the civil rights movement, a lot of folks just think of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. But the civil rights movements for African Americans is very diverse. There's a lot more nuance into that movement. But then also there are other groups of people during that time period. Mexican Americans specifically are, and you actually have a Chicano Tejano divide during that time period, and then LGBT civil rights movements, which my dissertation is on the formation of the LGBT civil rights movement in Dallas from 1965 to the modern era, or to 2020 or 2003 rather. So I really like civil rights. Like, how do these normal everyday people live their lives, and how do they make space for themselves in America in any given time period?
So, really, you have a lot of experience in that going against the grain,
Yeah.
so to speak. The
Right.
people who went against the grain. Because, so that's where I'm kind of like, we're gonna steer into the idea of morality, or like what is right, what is tradition, what is standard.
Right.
Because I think that in like recent news, we have people who are saying that morality is on the decline here in the United States based on those movements. The movements of we have gay rights, transgender. There's a lot on healthcare right now, and it's all, oh well, these people are going against the grain, right? Like this is breaking tradition, and we're going back on what we need to be doing, and we need to go back to the good old days, right?
Right.
So, do you think that based on everything that you've done, has morality actually begun to shift, or are we hearing this in light of these changes? Like it's more just pushback.
I think it's pushback, and I think that this is not a new idea in American history. So we see this idea of morality is waning in the 19th century, especially with this increase in immigration, especially from Eastern and Southern Europe. And at the time, the predominant ruling class in this country, or people who are predominantly most active politically, are Protestant folks. And so you have these Catholics coming over, and there is this movement, this belief that we're losing our morality. And as a result, you see specifically with the temperance movements, the idea if we can just get rid of alcohol in society, because a lot of folks attribute Catholicism with drinking of wine and alcohol, and the idea that if we can monitor or reduce alcohol in this country, then it's going to save the morality of the
Mm-hmm.
people, right? What we see though as a result of the temperance movement is and during prohibition, the uptick in crime, in especially underground crime, right? So like this is where you get your mobster era
Mm-hmm.
with like Al Capone and the black market, and that stuff. Once we repeal the prohibition of alcohol in this country, those underground crime networks continue to exist, right? And then in the 1950s, so we have the Cold War going on. And with the Cold War, it's basically just to kind of, like a little like bumper sticker, it's the West, which is predominantly led by the United States, against the Soviets, i.e., Russia. And in communism, the idea is that you want folks to be 100% independent, or not independent, 100% dependent on the state. So the Soviets want everyone in the country to depend on the state for all of their goods, all of their needs. And one of the things that the Soviets early on start doing is like raising taxes on like church properties, things like that. So eliminating churches and the need for religion. So the West, knowing that about the Soviets, decide that they're going to double down on religion in this country. And as a result of this, you see the phrase "In God We Trust" on our money,
Mm-hmm.
which a lot of my students don't realize that
That's
prior to the
huge.
1950s, that did not exist on American currency. Also, we add into this the Pledge of Allegiance, "One Nation under God,"
Mm-hmm.
which did not exist until the 1950s. So, like trying to root ourselves in morality. And then, obviously, when you get to the 60s, early on in the 60s, a lot of folks in these early movements are going to be influenced by the education system that they received in the 1950s. And what I'm talking about there is, again, to counter communism, you start seeing systems and school districts discussing things like the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution more heavily in the classroom. And so when those kids from the schoolrooms of the 50s graduate and start colleges in the early 60s, and they hear, oh, we are one nation under God, yes, but also that all men are created equal, then they're looking around and saying, we're not all being treated equal, right? So that's the reason, or kind of like the pushback against this segregationist movement in the 1960s. And if you'll look closely at those movements, not just Martin Luther King, but you'll see that there are a lot of ministers, especially white Protestant and Catholic ministers, who join in with Martin Luther King in this movement in the early 60s. Now, as the movement starts to flail at the end of the 60s, especially with the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy Jr., or Robert Kennedy, not Jr., we see that that it's kind of becomes like very chaotic, and this is where we see the backlash against the civil rights movement, and people saying, "Oh, these are like really radical folks out there, and things are changing too much." And I think a lot of times when people are saying that we're losing our morality, it's when things change and rapidly change, and people don't see the America they quote unquote grew up in,
Right.
right? And so then we're losing morality again, which as a result is the creation of the Southern Strategy under Richard
Mm-hmm.
Nixon, which you and I had previously talked about, which is a movement that the Republican Party specifically goes out and tries to win back these disaffected white Southerners to the Republican Party. And then by the end of the 70s, you have these evangelical ministers who are becoming more politically active, like Jerry Falwell, and they create the Moral Majority, where they're out there actively bringing national politics to the pulpit.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're talking about the moral decline of the country, because things are still kind of in flux from the 60s and the 70s, people who see that their world is changing, it gives them fear. And so they want to hold on to that, right? Just like with Donald Trump and Make America Great Again, which he wasn't the first to use that. Ronald Reagan used the same slogan. So you have Ronald Reagan using this in the early 80s. Like, let's go back to this time period where America was not in chaos, when America was more, regulated, if you will. And for a lot of folks, especially older folks, that sounds good to them because they were more comfortable back then, right? But the problem is, what America are they talking about? And typically they're talking about America where a lot of folks don't have any rights, right? And so that's where the kind of nuance comes into this idea of morality and control. Is it really you are afraid of America's moral politics or moral compass? Or are you just afraid of how the nation is changing and looking around you, right? Like you don't see yourself in it as much.
So it seems like it's really that idea, that comment is really just based on this like desire to maintain power and control.
Well, and even if you go back to the founding, which I am not a expert of of early America by any stretch of the imagination, but I do know quite a bit about it. Our founding fathers were not super religious individuals.
Are they called deists? Is that right?
Many of them were deists, right? So basically, a deist believes that there's a God, but they believe in science. So, like, maybe God set everything in motion, but then, like, through natural scientific discovery and elements, that's how the world works, right? So, in a deist mind, from what I understand, God isn't going to just come in and intervene in an event, right? Like,
you have
just
the tools.
Yeah.
That's on you.
Science is there. This is what creates. He created the world. He set it in motion, and then step back and let science do its thing. Also, our country is founded on the idea of religious freedom,
Right.
Which our founding fathers did on purpose, and the framers of the Constitution. This idea that you should not have one national religion or one religion that governs all folks. And I think that for many people, especially today, especially you have a large, again, from the moral majority, which does not technically exist anymore, but it did ramp up these Christian evangelicals who are still very politically active today. They're keen on legislating their moral compass, but I would push back against that because I would assume that those folks, so for example, I believe it's Oklahoma, I believe it's Oklahoma, recently mandated that the Ten Commandments, or was it Louisiana? One of those two states said that the Ten Commandments have to be on every wall. Maybe it was Louisiana. The Ten Commandments have to be on every wall in the classroom, which is fine and good, I guess. But let's pretend that Jewish folks take over control of Louisiana. And how are they going to feel if they say, okay, well, we have to take all of those 10 commandments down, and now you have to teach from the Torah? Like, a lot of folks would be very upset, right? Or, if Muslim leaders were to take over and say, okay, you have to pray 5 times a day, and you have to, everybody gets their prayer rug, and you have to stop school for these prayers specifically, there would probably be a lot of pushback against that. So I think that them pushing their religious morality into legislative issues is antithetical to the founding fathers, and I think that they would be very upset if other religious organizations or groups were doing the same to them.
So obviously, like we are seeing where it's kind of beginning to bleed into our individual freedoms. What kind of standard? Because we have, how do you think that the imposition of these kinds of standards affect the social groups that we know about? How do the standards that are attached to certain religions affect those people?
Um, so do the standards attached to certain religions affect people outside of that religion?
Right. Like, especially whenever it's imposed legislatively.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that it's interesting. So we'll just go back to this idea of like Christian versus Judaism. So, for example, and this is a hot topic issue right now and has been since the Dobbs decision. All right. So, evangelicals will say that life is at the moment of conception, right? Like as soon as there's a heartbeat, that's life,
Right.
correct? And as a result of this, they are against any or almost any. There are various, like I will concede that there are various stipulations or exceptions to the rule, but for the most part, once a heartbeat has been detected, they do not want any form of abortion to take place. Well, in the Jewish faith, life doesn't begin until you breathe air.
I see.
Right? So when you have these evangelical Christians arguing that life is at the moment of conception, they are passing these laws like the Texas has the heartbeat bill. So after 6 weeks or once a heartbeat is detected, you cannot perform an abortion because that is life. Well, in the Jewish faith, that is not life.
Right.
So you've now taken, like hypothetically, you've passed this law that says you cannot have an abortion in the state of Texas after 6 weeks or once a heartbeat is detected because it's life. But let's say you're a Jewish mother and let's say that you have a non-viable pregnancy or for any other list of reasons, which, and this is my personal opinion, should be between a woman and her doctor, right? If she needs an abortion or opts for an abortion, but because this Christian definition says it's life, well, in her religious definition, it's not life. But you've now mandated a Christian perspective that is impacting the life of a Jewish woman, right? So that's a violation of her religious freedoms. So
Okay. And so where has, because you have some experience with the gay rights movements, could you give us some examples where the enforcement of these specific, if we're going off of, like the evangelical Christian, that's where the most, controversial issues lie here, where the enforcement of their specific moral values has led to that, like marginalization of groups.
yeah, so specifically, again, my research is in Texas. So in the early 20th century, actually closer to like 18, I think it was 1870s, Texas passed a penal code that said that sodomy was illegal. And to be clear here, what they're talking about is any sexual contact um, outside of like traditional like vaginal sex, right? So not to be like too like crazy. And this could be between any adult. Oh, and in the 19th century, it included any sexual contact with animals.
Okay.
So that was also written into the code. Okay, and that's what they defined as sodomy. This code existed until the early 1970s, but in 1973, I believe, um, the Texas state legislature changed the definition of sodomy to be acts between same sex individuals, right? So this could be anal, oral, or any other kind of like sexual contact. And from that point forward, so heterosexual individuals, and they also removed the, in like animal uh, portion of that law. So from that moment forward, essentially homosexuals became a crime. They became criminal, right? And the reason that I'm going with this argument here is that the penal code read this way, and as a result of this, gay individuals were not only being targeted by police raids, which 100% existed even before the 1970s, like as far back as the early 20th century for different laws like cross dressing and whatnot. But specifically, the Texas Code criminalizes homosexuality. And as a result of that, these individuals could not work in jobs like police officers or firefighters. And a lot of people don't realize is that in order to get jobs in the 70s, not just city jobs, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and this woman wrote in about how her mother had to pass a lie detector test to work at Radio Shack in the 70s. Like it was very common to have lie detector tests for a myriad of jobs, but in the state of Texas, lie detector tests were given, or especially Dallas County, for working in the fire department, working in the police department, and one of the tests was, are you a homosexual? And if you said yes, well, then you're automatically removed from the hiring process because you're committing a crime. Just like today, most police officers or most police departments aren't going to go out and hire somebody who deals drugs.
Right.
Right? That's a bad idea.
Yeah.
Like, you are breaking the law, and we're over here enforcing the law, so you probably should not be working for us. Right? Well, they saw sodomy and homosexuality as a criminal offense, and as a result, you could not get this job. But then you could try to lie and hopefully not get caught. But those who lied, the lie detector test usually, and then you get detected, so you cannot have this job. So you've now taken this moral idea of what it means to be a sexual being, and you've created a criminal code around it, which has now denied an entire section of people opportunities for employment, not just in the police department or the fire department. But in some of my research, there were like hospitals doing the same lie detector test, right? And if you fail, you can't work at the hospital now. So you're limiting employment opportunities for individuals based solely on their sexuality because it's a criminal offense to be homosexual in the state.
So I didn't have this written down and I didn't prepare you for this question, but just now because I'm interested, what is the evolution, if you can answer this, what is the evolution of sodomy or homosexuality becoming a crime? Because we have those laws that where it's written in, and what year did you say?
So the early 70s is when it
Early
becomes
70s.
specifically between same-sex partners.
Okay. And it was just then, or were there other?
So sodomy existed prior to this, and a lot of it kind of like starts to trickle up in the mid to late 19th century, along with cross-dressing laws, ways to regulate individuals' bodies, right? So, for example, you would have some laws saying that if you were spotted wearing a certain number of like 3 pieces of clothing that belong to the opposite sex, you could be arrested.
Okay.
Yeah, things like that. And I always tell my students, this is a fun fact. So there is a woman in Houston. Her name is Rita Rainstorm, and she actually owned a lesbian bar that frequently was raided in Houston. And the cops would come in and arrest them because they were violating cross-dressing laws because the women there were wearing men's pants. And so my students have asked, like, how do they know that they're wearing men's pants? Well, all of the vast majority of jeans today are button and zip in the front. But in the 50s, 60s, and even parts of the 70s, women's jeans actually zipped on the side. So if they walk into a bar and they notice that a bunch of women have, button up or fly zip in the front, that they're clearly wearing men's jeans. So that's kind of how they were targeted. Yeah.
Yeah, it would have been a problem. I like shopping in the men's t-shirts at
Yeah.
Walmart, so
Yeah, so
been a problem.
so it kind of starts with like regulation of that. And then like I said before, before the early 70s in Texas, it was married individuals were included, or heterosexual, not just married, but heterosexual individuals were included. There were pushes or pushback against those laws with married folks trying to overturn the sodomy law in Texas from the late 60s. And so, a kind of way to eliminate this pushback with heterosexual individuals, they just changed it from anybody to just same-sex individuals. And so you start seeing the gay community pushing back in 1979, 1978. Don Baker filed the first federal court case against the sodomy law in Texas. It's called Baker versus Wade, which the Wade is the same guy from Roe v. Wade.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he is the district attorney there in Dallas. So the Baker case goes forward. In the early 80s, it's actually ruled to be unconstitutional. Then the state of Texas challenges that decision to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is based down in New Orleans, which is a very conservative court of appeals, and they overturn the Baker decision. But ultimately, it will be in 2003 with a Lawrence v. Texas case that goes to the U.S. Supreme Court that determines that sodomy laws are unconstitutional. Which, by the way, with the Dobbs decision, going back to kind of how this all ties in one of the opinions issued during from the decision of Dobbs, uh, Justice Clarence Thomas mentioned that the Griswold v. Connecticut case, which is a access to birth control and like reproductive rights, in the Griswold case, and in the Lawrence v. Texas case, and in the Obergefell case, which is what 2015, which legalizes gay marriage, that all three of those cases should be reconsidered by the Supreme Court and could potentially be overturned. And Justice Thomas kind of issues like a roadmap on how to overturn those things.
Right. So that the kind of resistance that we saw were in those legal cases, and how does that legacy bring us to today? How does that influence social and political debates now?
So I think that a lot of the movement is, or a lot of the I'm trying to figure out how I would say this. I think that you see a lot of people using the court system as a way to uphold civil rights in the country. And this has always been, right? Like the way that our system is designed is that we have our constitution, we have these separate branches of government that are supposed to divide out power, but ultimately if you have a problem or concern with a law, you can challenge that law, and if the Supreme Court takes it up, then the Supreme Court can like basically hear the case from the average citizen. I get it that the average citizen is not the one out there arguing the case, but typically there are like lawyers who are representing the average citizen to hear that case or to try that case before the U.S. Supreme Court. And I think that that is often how the movements have gained um, legitimacy and have gained their rights through either legislative endeavors. So, for the African American Civil Rights Movement, things like the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And then for like the gay community, the passing or the acknowledgement of Lawrence v. Texas and the Obergefell or
Obergefell.
yes, you would think as a gay historian or a historian who studies gay history could say that word, but yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so you see that through their efforts to kind of gain rights collectively in this country. Um, and there is, I do see kind of like rumblings in gay activist organizations today about the fear of the modern Supreme Court that we have today. And is Clarence Thomas signaling that these things should be overturned? Will we see a rolling back of some of these civil rights? Will gay marriage be taken away? Will sodomy laws be reinstated? So here's a fun fact as a Texas historian. So the sodomy law in the Texas State Code, Penal Code, still exists today. It is still in the code. There's an asterisk beside it, and at the bottom of the Penal Code, it says, basically, I'm gonna like paraphrase here, that this code is no longer constitutional as ruled in Lawrence v. Texas. But if they overturn Lawrence v. Texas, that asterisk goes away, and immediately the sodomy law goes back into effect.
People can be charged.
And people, well, and it's not even people can be charged. Yes, people can be charged, but people who identify as gay would then become instant criminals again, right? And people who are vocally out could potentially be denied jobs because you are a criminal, like you are engaging in criminal behavior, right? So that is a little bit alarming for a lot of folks.
Oh yeah, I can understand why.
Yeah.
So from what I understand, this is kind of an initiative to maintain like the nuclear family, right? Like this standard, in quotations. I don't know too much about Project 2025.
Okay.
Where do we have in there? Because what I've been reading, I saw some stuff about certain tax, what are they called?
Like tax credits?
Yeah, tax credits for having kids. And from what I remember studying in World War II, I believe the Nazis did the same thing,
They
right?
did something similar, yes.
Yeah, it was to
encourage
And yeah,
people
encourage people to have kids.
to have good Aryan babies.
Yeah, and that's what this is like, rubbing up against that, definitely. So, what I don't know if you kind of answered this already, but in areas like education and healthcare, what do these moral standards, like what kind of influence do they have on those public policies?
So I think that it depends on one, what state you live in,
Mm.
and two, like what expectations are passed with these legislative measures. So like right now, I believe, and I think it's Louisiana that says like all the states have to have the Ten Commandments on the wall. I do not know for sure, and I could be wrong if it says, oh, you have to teach the Ten Commandments, right? So maybe it's just that you have the Ten Commandments on the wall, and maybe there isn't a lot of like overlap in your education system, right? But there is definitely potential there, right? Like that you're going to teach this moral code as a part of your curriculum, which is potentially problematic.
Wasn't that a conversation in Florida too?
Yeah, and the other problem that we have, and this is happening here in Texas, is and Greg Abbott, the current governor, has called numerous special sessions about the voucher system in the state of Texas, which I am staunchly against the voucher system. And to be completely transparent, my mother was an educator in a public school for 25 years. So I'm 100% team public school, right?
I'm gonna pretend that I know what the voucher system is, but for my audience,
Yeah.
Will you give like
Yeah.
a quick?
So the voucher system, the way it works is if like just like make up a town. So like I live in Bullard. So I currently live in Bullard. And let's say my fiance and I, we do not have kids, but let's say that we did. Under the voucher system, let's say that, and we'll just use easy historian math, that we pay $5,000 a year to Bullard ISD and school taxes. Under the voucher system, we could take that $5,000 and we could, instead of it going towards Bullard ISD with our imaginary children, let's say we want our kids to go to private school and Brook Hill is there in Bullard. So we're going to send our kids to Brook Hill and we have $5,000 in voucher from the state. And let's say it's $15,000 to go to Brook Hill. So we give them our $5,000 in state vouchers, which Brook Hill would then get $5,000 from the state of Texas. And then we would be responsible for covering the rest of the tuition. Okay, so we'd be out $10,000 a year. And those are all made up numbers. I have no idea how much it costs to go to Brook Hill, right? That's how the voucher system works.
Okay.
The voucher system is a terrible idea. The reason people want the voucher system is because they want their kids to go to private schools, which are usually parochial schools or schools run by a religious institution. So, like All Saints here, we have Grace, we have TK Gorman, which are all private Christian schools in Tyler, Texas, right? If I take my voucher and send my kid to a private school where they're being taught a Christian education in addition to like whatever, like math and science and all of that other stuff, um, I'm using state funded money to send my kid to a private school. The problem that I have with that, well, one, we already underfund public school in this state. Again, my mother was an educator for 25 years. I remember my mother having to use her own money to buy supplies for her classroom, right? Like, and every teacher I know, and I know a lot of them, they have to self fund their classrooms because the state does not provide enough. Okay, so now you're going to have families who have means already get their tax money voucher, send their kid to a private school. So you're going to have a decrease in public schools. So public schools aren't going to get as much funding. But who's left in those public schools but lower income folks who now have less resources and are unable to, maybe learn as much because the teachers and the school system doesn't have the money to provide adequate teaching to them, right? That's why I think the voucher system is a terrible idea. And you have to ask yourself, why do you want your kids going to a private school? Oh, well, public schools aren't good enough. That's what they'll tell you, right? Or is it because you are usually very religious and you want your kids receiving this parochial education, right? If I decide to have kids and I decide to send them to a public school, my tax dollars pay for that. If I decide to send them to a private school, I should have to pay for that, right? If I live in the state of Texas. My taxes pay for roads. Just because I don't drive on roads in West Texas doesn't mean that I should be able to say, okay, all the money that my taxes go to fund those roads in West Texas, I want it back so I can put it on the toll road.
Yeah.
right? Like I pay to drive on the toll
Yeah.
road because that's how you fund that
Uh-huh.
road. Does that make sense?
So sending all of those kids to that private school creates a, what is the word? Not reinforcement, but I guess yes, a reinforcement of all these things that we're critiquing.
Yes,
Like,
absolutely. And on top of that, you're creating another wall or another barrier for poorer people,
mm-hmm,
right? Like so these poor people who cannot afford that extra, like let's use the math that I use, $10,000 a year
mm-hmm,
to send their kid to a private school. Well, they're now going to be in a public school that has much fewer resources. And now, what is the likelihood that they're going to receive a really good education, that they can go to a good college or they can get into a
so we
trade
go
school?
back to the pre-GI Bill where not
Yes,
anyone could afford an education.
right. And I would also point out, this wasn't as rampant in the state of Texas, but in Mississippi it was. And by the way, Mississippi is one of the lowest in education in this country. It was very prominent in the state of Mississippi as desegregation is happening. Parochial schools start popping up, and you have middle class and upper middle class white folks sending all of their kids to these parochial schools, these private schools, and the defunding of public schools. And look at where Mississippi is at today. And the people who went to those public schools, what's the likelihood that they're going to be able to get out and make something of themselves? So it's just, in my opinion, it's an extreme injustice to not only the teachers who are in the schools today. Like these folks are heroes, in my
Yeah.
opinion. They're in there. They don't make a ton of money. They get zero respect, right? Like
That's why I won't do it.
so they get zero respect. And they do it because they do care and
Mhm.
they love teaching and they want to make a difference, right? But it's also a disservice to these poorer families,
It is.
right? So
Yeah.
you're only setting them up to continue to be poor.
So there's a clear, because this all goes back to this conversation of forced morality.
Yeah.
And there's a clear relationship between obviously power dynamics, because like what we're talking about will reinforce eventually. All of these people grow up, they get out of the private schools and they go to college and then they end up in the legislator. You know, like
Yeah.
they take over all of those jobs where then they'll recreate everything that we're dealing
Yeah.
with. So
And one more thing, I would argue that public schools need more funding without a doubt. But also public schools are great in a way that private schools aren't, because public schools are going to force you to interact with people who are different than you. Right? And when you do that, you can maybe better understand where someone's coming from. And also, you are more likely to be empathetic towards people. But when you spend all of your time around people who look like you, sound like you, and believe like you, when you go out into the real world, you're not willing to learn and listen to people who are different.
Yeah.
Right? And the same is true for people who homeschool, right? Their kids, I feel like, aren't getting exposed to different beliefs. And I'm not saying that your beliefs are wrong by any stretch of the imagination, right? Like, whatever religious and political beliefs that you have, I firmly believe you're allowed to have those beliefs. Like, that's the beauty of living in a democracy and in a country where we don't legislate religious beliefs, or should not legislate religious beliefs, right? But you're doing a disservice to not only your kids, but to the future of this country, right? We are a multicultural country and we should be able to, have relationships with people who are different from us without it being a transactional affair, or without it being like, well, I have to give up this in order to see you on this measure, right?
So, what do you think are the long term social cultural consequences of continuing down this path? Like where we are now?
So, as historians, we do not like to predict the future. But I will say that I would hope that we're able to see the value in diversity, and that we're able to see the value in people who are different from us, that there is value there, that we are a multicultural society, and that doesn't make us weaker in any stretch of the imagination, either domestically or internationally. I think that actually makes us stronger. So I cannot predict where we are going, but I would hope that we are able to find more common ground. And I do believe You know, and maybe it's a little cliche, but I do believe that most Americans have a lot more in common than they have different.
Mhm.
But unfortunately, with the heightened political rhetoric of like the last 10 years, that the things that divide us are what's magnified. And as a result of that, we've like, you know, siloed into encampments and we refuse to have conversations with people on the opposite side, whatever that is. And I would hope that we can maybe like let that guard down a little bit. Because I do believe, and you know, I strongly believe that there are people from all walks of life who are valuable and have valuable insight and can, you know, contribute to the project that is the United States of America, right? And we should always see it, or I always see it as this like ideal of what it is to be the United States, and we should continue to try to achieve those goals that were laid out to us by our forefathers, who were not perfect, by the way. There's a lot of you know talk about you know the nastiness of the founding fathers, and there are a lot of areas in which they were not great,
Yeah.
right? But I don't think that we can just write them off. And I think that we should, you know, I think they had a vision for this country. I think that in the framing of the Constitution, that it was vague in a lot of areas so that we could grow into it. And I think that, you know, just trying to restrict or limit the impact that certain groups have is you know taking us backwards, and I would hope that we can continue to go forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to get too bleak and end up in like Handmaid's Tale
No.
scenario. So I think that you've answered all of my questions for
Excellent.
today.